Just a day after the big ambition of the programme for government was revealed, executive ministers are warned we're heading for another budget cliff edge. How and when do we get this ongoing saga resolved and begin to build secure and stable finances here? I'll be discussing that and more with my panel of guests, and later we'll be joined by some expert witnesses to reflect on what the politicians have to say. Hello, where do you start? The politics of this place barely took a breath over the summer. The big story tonight is this week's eventual agreement on a government plan of action, although significant concerns remain about how that plan can be delivered and paid for. A day after the big launch, did we see a move towards revenue raising by a finance minister who's also nervously watching ministerial colleagues potentially spending their way into the Treasury's bad books? And to top it all, there's a political argument which runs along the lines of, to hell with budget constraints, we need to do whatever's necessary to provide critical services to those who depend on them. I'll discuss all of that with my panel in just a moment, but first, here's a flavour of the state we're in.
I'm very glad that we have reached another milestone for this four-party executive and that we have agreed our programme for government.
The 9 immediate priorities are to grow a globally competitive and sustainable economy, to deliver more affordable childcare.
My whole wage and a bit more goes in childcare. Last month I was working for £1.32 an hour.
To cut health waiting times.
I think it's really unfair. I've been left with no option now but to go elsewhere for surgery, and it doesn't rest easy for me that I have to pay for that.
Ending violence against women and girls.
Just as a woman living here, you don't, even at my age, and I'm nearly retirement age, you don't feel safe going out on your own at night, and you should.
Better support for children and young people with special educational needs.
There's nothing. At 19, there's no safety net. There's nothing to hold the government to account.
We want this to change, and we want these kids and these young people to be provided for.
To provide more social, affordable and sustainable housing.
So we're simply not building enough social homes, we're not building enough affordable homes. We really ought to learn the lesson from Dublin and tackle the problem now before it gets worse.
Safer communities.
I honestly am not asking for the earth or the world. I'm just asking to get us back to a number of officers that will allow us to keep the people of Northern Ireland safe.
Protecting Lough Neagh and the environment.
These sludgy mats that you see behind us are full of E. coli, salmonella, clostridium, bacteria that really are going to make people ill if they consume them, they touch their face, they get it into their mouths.
We look forward to listening to people, to speaking with people, but importantly, in delivering for people on the issues that matter most.
So how can all of that be put right? I'm joined now by Stormont's opposition leader Matthew O'Toole from the SDLP, the Alliance Party's Paula Bradshaw, who chairs the committee for the Executive Office, the DUP's North Belfast MLA Philip Brett, and the Sinn Féin MP Chris Hazard. Thanks very much for coming into the studio tonight. By the way, the Ulster Unionists were also invited to be here, but we were told the party has no one available to join us. So let me start with you, Chris Hazard. We'll come on to the programme for government and today's Treasury meeting in just a moment, but I want to start with this week's development on the rates review by your colleague Kiva Archibald, the Finance Minister. She's indicated changes to rates which could see some households and businesses paying more. That's on the cards. Do we all agree this is a move towards revenue raising, and do the 4 executive parties support it?
Well, I think, Mark, to be fair, there has been increased revenue raising already this year. The executive have raised an additional £80 million in revenue this year. I don't think any of the executive parties have shied away from the discussion that is required around revenue raising. But the most important thing that is done in conjunction with the strategic priorities of the economic development of the executive, but also...
Yeah, but what about the rates? What about these specific issues, this review?
But also that it's done that it's fair and it's equitable, and that we don't lump charges on the backs of workers and hard-pressed families who simply can't afford them. It's my understanding that the Finance Minister is going to be bringing forward proposals around a new rate system in the weeks ahead, and I would hope, and I'm sure it will be, a progressive proposal, and hopefully it'll have the backing of the executive.
OK, does it, as far as you understand it, Philip Brett, have the backing of the executive, specifically of the DUP?
There's been no proposals from the Finance Minister brought to either the Executive or to the Finance Committee at this stage. We support the Finance Minister looking at options, but we will judge those options upon the clear mandate that we received at the last election, and that was to ensure that hard-pressed families aren't burdened with further financial pressure. It's the responsibility of the Finance Minister to come forward with their proposals, and we will look at them and judge them against those tests, but ultimately we can't say that until we see her proposals.
Yeah, the difficulty is, of course, that if this doesn't go through and if there isn't some form of revenue raising that deals with the maths as they are at Stormont, then the people that you're talking about are going to be burdened with other cuts in their public services.
Well, Mark, you'll recall this is the point that we made in January when some parties were telling us that the financial package that was agreed was eye-watering. Others were saying that we shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. We were very clear that for a number of years Northern Ireland has been underfunded. We're welcome the fact that this new interim fiscal framework has been agreed, and that's why the First and Deputy First Minister, along with the Finance Minister, continue to make the case to Treasury, and we look forward to another successful outcome, hopefully, on that.
Yeah, let's talk about rates specifically. Paula Bradshaw, does Alliance support what we think is coming down the tracks as far as this rates review is concerned? We haven't seen the details, but we've heard what the Minister's thinking is.
Well, likewise, we haven't seen the details either.
Well, what about the principle of what she said so far?
What we have always said in terms of this consultation around this form of revenue raising is that we would want to see anything being brought forward in the context of the reform and transformation of our public services. We cannot go back to people and ask them to pay more money when we have public services that are desperately needing to be improved, because it's not fair on people. But we are realists. We recognise that if we're going to support the people who are most vulnerable and in need in our society, we're going to need more money. But we will judge any proposals coming from the Finance Minister on their merits and with the research and backing that will go along with those.
Yeah, she had to put something on the table, presumably ahead of today's meeting with the Treasury, to indicate that she was intending to do something to deal with the issue of revenue raising, which is one of the demands that the Treasury has made, of course, on the Executive.
Well, of course, and we represent people who are in dire need of better public services. So, of course, we're going to look at any proposals that come forward from the
because those services need to be paid for.
Absolutely, they have to, but they have to be fit for purpose. We want them to be as efficient as possible. And so we are pressing very much around the transformation of services, along with any revenue raising that the Finance Minister will be bringing.
OK, so she's talking about, as I understand it, our Economics and Business Editor, John Campbell, has put a figure of about £10 million a year in terms of revenue that could be raised if some of the things that we understand the Minister is looking at are acted upon. That would be raising the domestic rates cap, the landlord's discount being scrapped, discount for early payment being scrapped, and perhaps an end to industrial de-rating. Could Alliance live with those if that's what's put on the table?
Well, again, in the context of better public services, but we feel as a party that we should be tackling the cost of division. I think that's a higher priority for us, and we're delighted that in the programme for government they're going to be looking at the peace mission around how we can deliver our public services in a way that is better for all our people. So
that's way down the tracks, isn't it?
Well,
that's way down the tracks at this stage.
But at the same time, we cannot go back to people and ask them for more money unless we can say that we can deliver better for them.
OK, let's bring in Stormont's Leader of the Opposition, Matthew O'Toole. Well, I don't know what you make of what you've heard just far, but it sounds far from a ringing endorsement from the Alliance Party and the DUP of what we think the Sinn Féin Finance Minister might be bringing to the Executive table. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, I think that a lot of this goes back to what happened in February when the Executive was formed and they agreed, the four Executive parties agreed up front to revenue raising as part of the package that was agreed to the British government. They then, including the Executive Ministers, it was in a letter. There was a letter that went from the Executive to the UK government that said we will raise revenue. It was in black and white and it was agreed to all along.
But not the detail.
OK, but the principle was agreed that revenue isn't going to happen, so I'm glad we've conceded that now. I think there seems to be a bit more.
Well, and Chris Hazard already said £80 million has been raised this year in terms of revenue.
Well, there was a regional rate rise. There was a regional
I presume that's what he's talking about.
That happened. That is, I think, what he's talking about. Look, what we've said as the opposition is that we will be constructive in all of these things. We won't simply throw snowballs. We set out a set of principles that if they were going to raise revenue, it would have to be progressive, it would have to be based It would have to be sensible, and it would have to be based on those who could pay it. But it would also have to be based first. It shouldn't happen this year, and I don't think it should happen next year either. But what I would say is that any proposal to, for example, look at the rate system. We've already had a rate rise this year, as Chris alluded to, and you pointed out. But it has to be based on a clear plan. I'm afraid this programme for government, published this week, is not a clear plan. I don't think the public out there who are experiencing dreadful public services would be willing to say, yes, by all means, we'll pay more money on the basis of the kind of flimsy platitudes that are in this document.
Yeah, I just want to ask you what you think, very, very quickly before we move on to other issues, what the manufacturing sector might think of a proposal to end industrial derating. You can imagine the hullabaloo that would follow.
So I've said constructively we'll look at any proposal that leads to better outcomes. I think specifically manufacturing, the industrial derating proposal, I think is very risky in terms of our proposition around dual market access. At the minute, we have a globally unique selling point, which is the ability to move goods into Britain and into the European single market of 500 million people. A huge calling card for Invest NI as we sell this place is going to be industrial derating. I think risking that would fly in the face of what the Economy Minister, to be fair to him, is trying to do around getting investment.
OK, let's talk about what your colleague, the Finance Minister, Chris Hazzard, has referred to as the grave consequences if her fellow executive ministers overspend their budgets this year, because that would break the deal with the Treasury, which of course essentially wrote off a previous debt of £500 million. Now, it's very interesting to hear a Sinn Féin Finance Minister who's talked a lot about austerity and argued against the way the Tories managed the economy over the past 14 years, saying to her executive colleagues, be very careful about your spending. You cannot bust your budgets.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have an exchequer. I would very much like the situation where an Irish exchequer was looking after some of these financial decisions, but it's a very different case when it comes to the executive. Executive ministers must be responsible. We must ensure there's collective responsibility. And the situation like we've seen today, I think those pictures are encouraging when you see Michelle O'Neill, Emma Little-Pengelly and Kiva Archibald, three strong female political leaders, it has to be said, in London, making the case for a fair, sustainable funding package going forward for the executive to be able to bring forward some of the transformation we're talking about, because
there was nothing substantial out of that meeting. It was a constructive meeting. Kiva Archibald made some positive noises afterwards, but there's nothing that we can get our teeth into tonight.
To be fair, though, there's an ongoing negotiation. It has already delivered an injection of £60 million into our public services this year, with more to come later this year as well. But that continued negotiation with the new British government is vitally important. Yeah. Revenue raising will only ever go so far here. We need a serious injection of resources if we are to meet the needs of this society.
Yeah, but here's the point. Presumably what Kiva Archibald is terrified of is that if ministers in the executive overspend in this financial year, the Treasury you're talking about is going to come back and say to Dr. Archibald, you see that £500 million that we wrote off last year, you're on the hook for it again this year.
Well, of course, that's been evident for some time. You know, that's part of, the adults being in the room, the four-party collective responsibility around the executive table. Right. We need to see...
So the Treasury holds all the cards, doesn't it?
Well, unfortunately, that has always been the case whenever it comes to the financial situation that we're in. I would rather it wasn't the case. I would rather we had much more fiscal levers to be able to have the firepower that we want to transform our education system, our health system and all the rest of it. But ministers, of course, around the executive table must work with collective responsibility.
Well, Mike Nesbitt is the health minister and he said he can't make cuts. He will have to overspend if that is necessary. He will bust his budget.
Well, look, I'm not going to second guess what the executive are going to do in the weeks and months
Well, that's
ahead.
what Mike Nesbitt said he's going to do, if he has to.
I have full confidence in the Finance Minister and Executive and being able to get the additional funds that are required to be able to bring a plan forward. Mike, as Health Minister...
No evidence of that whatsoever.
Well, Mike, as Health Minister, now needs to be bringing a plan forward in conjunction with the programme for government. We'll see departmental implementation plans in the weeks ahead, and that's what the Health Minister is going to have to do.
OK, so there's £500 million extra coming in Barnett consequentials, and the Health Minister Philip Brett, or the Finance Minister Philip Brett, has already said that that leaves her something in the region of £267 million short of what she needs. So there's no extra money coming Mike Nesbitt's way. There's no extra money apparently coming Paul Givan, the Education Minister's way. And we know the pressure that their budgets, and indeed other executive ministers, are under.
Well, for Mike Nesbitt's budget, there was something coming. He just got an extra £76 million to tackle waiting lists. So there has been additional money given to the Department of Health and to other departments.
Won't solve the issue of waiting lists.
And that's why this programme for government is important, because the two key things to this as well will be prioritisation and transformation.
Philip, you know very well, we talked about this in our Red Lines podcast yesterday. 88-page document talks about one of the 9 priorities is to reduce waiting lists. And elsewhere in that same document it says, and by the way, with the current funding regime in place, we can't reduce waiting lists.
And what it also says is that a plan for transformation is vital to this. We were promised a reconfiguration proposal from the Department for Health before the summer recess. It's now time that we do see that, because that's where key transformation savings will be made. We have a transformation fund that has now been agreed as a result of engagement between the Executive and the Treasury, and this is where those funds will need to be found.
Yeah, but we don't know exactly how that's being paid for, and I think that's probably a separate conversation. If Mike Nesbitt was here, he would say that that's not entirely the same conversation as dealing with waiting lists.
Mike Nesbitt and his party were invited to come along here this evening, so none of us can speak for him, but there's a job of work for them to do, and they simply need to get on with it.
Okay.
Can I just add there? There's a report today published in Britain which spells out that the NHS in England is on the brink of terminal collapse if it doesn't get generational investment that the British Prime Minister himself has now outlined. If anybody thinks that a devolved assembly, be it Belfast or Cardiff or Edinburgh, has the financial power to do this when they're underfunded already, and the Treasury has already acknowledged, this is going to require significant investment from the centre, and people need to understand that.
Yeah, well, the Treasury, of course, has accepted that additional needs funding of 124%. I know there's an argument, and your party has made the argument, hasn't it, Paula Bradshaw, that it should be 127%. Yes. Don't know if there's any traction. I mean, do your executive colleagues agree with that? Do you know if the Treasury is minded to accept that?
Well, I think that the summer of disturbances has very much demonstrated Naomi Long, the Justice Minister's call for a long time, that the fiscal framework would include our particular circumstances here around policing and justice. So we will continue to push for that, and I think all the parties are on the same page as us now as to how that formula should be calculated in terms of what our
just proves the kind of pressure that other budgets are under too. It's not all about health and education. Your minister,
Absolutely. Justice,
is under huge pressure. We know the pressures that the prison system's under and that policing is under. Absolutely. Barely a mention in the programme for government about policing.
Well, I think in terms of the priorities, there's one that stands out clearly, and that's around creating safer communities. And in terms of the constituents that I represent, they are crying out for more support.
Sure, but you might expect it in a programme for government. If it was along the Welsh or the Scottish models, would say how many police officers, how many additional police officers we were going to get, how we were going to pay for that, how we were going to deal with the issue of overtime, how we were going to deal with the issue of sickness within the police service, all of those issues. Yeah. There are no numbers that go with this programme for government.
Well, first of all, it's a draft programme for government, and if we in the Alliance Party were developing it ourselves, it would look very different, but it's a four-party code.
But you don't expect the members of the public who are going to be consulted in this to put the numbers in for the ministers, do you?
Well, if you'd let me finish. So we've got 8 or 9 weeks now of a consultation process, and I would very much encourage people, especially as chair of the Executive Office Committee, to respond to that. So this is not the finished article, and it will have an implementation plan at the far end of it. And the work within the Justice Department will continue. She will continue to work with the Chief Constable to try and push for more money and to look at recruitment. So this is not just the only show in town in terms of what the Justice Minister and other ministers are doing. This is the cross-departmental work plan, and other things will feed into it, not least the Executive's legislative programme. So while people may go through the document and not see things that aren't in it, it doesn't mean to say that the ministers won't continue to deliver on the issues that are in front of them.
Yeah, OK, Matthew Toole, what do you make of that? Does that make sense?
Well, I'm reminded of what of the presidential debate the other night. Donald Trump was asked if he had a plan, and he said he had a concept of a plan. I would say that's probably a fair description of the programme for government. It's kind of a concept of a plan. There's lots of descriptive text, there's lots of platitude, but there isn't clarity. Ultimately, government is about making choices, and it's about the people that we serve. There are people watching this tonight who will have been waiting for years for hip or knee surgery. There'll be people whose children are waiting for SEN, special educational needs provision, or people who are in severe housing need. And I don't mean to get corny, but those people do need to understand that there's a plan to deal with that. And I don't think they would, based on this. I just want to say one...
Can I just point out one thing, just because I think it is relevant, that there have been individuals who've commented on this, who've been negative and who've been critical. There have been others, like, for example, Dr. Alan Stout, who represents GPs in Northern Ireland, who said he thinks that the draft programme for government is a good piece of work, and he's pleased that there aren't targets contained within it, because he doesn't think they would be particularly helpful. He thinks it's a useful piece of work.
He's perfectly entitled to that opinion. I would say there are many other people who do think that a meaningful programme for government, a plan for government, has to include, I think if you compare, people were comparing earlier on other devolved administrations, if you go and look at programmes for government that recent Scottish governments have produced, they do involve very clear outcomes, targets by the end either of the mandate or by the end of the decade, and clear bits of legislation that are going to be passed or interventions.
We already have that. We have the legislative programme. I think you're being a wee bit disingenuous here around what is in that plan. I have gone through page by page. There is a lot of detail in that. I'm not here to defend the First and Deputy First Minister, but I think you're being disingenuous.
I'm not being disingenuous.
No, I think you are.
I'm not being disingenuous at all. Now, there's a really important point here, Mark. This idea that criticism of a programme for government is illegitimate. Hang on, Paula, you had your say, let me have mine. We have here a four-party executive that are quite a lot of the time fighting one another and disagreeing with one another on quite basic things, but they seem resistant to the idea of an opposition offering constructive but robust criticism of the plan for government.
Which presumably is perfectly reasonable in democracy. I mean, you accept that, don't you? That's this man's job, isn't it?
You know, his job to present an alternative.
It is, and some people were critical of journalists for asking apparently negative questions. But I mean, again, it is the job of journalists to ask questions. Sinn Féin plays an opposition role south of the border. You're very quick to criticise the government down there. You don't like it very much whenever there's criticism up here. Your First Minister had a real go at Matthew O'Toole in the chamber earlier this week.
When it comes to being adults in the room and understanding responsibility, as an opposition, as a fully funded opposition, you provide the alternative that is required.
Can I say one thing?
And we do so.
Can I say one thing about this? There's a whole lot of sweetness and light and butter wouldn't melt that's gone on over the past week. These two parties, Sinn Féin and the DUP, collapsed government here for half a decade between them. That contributed, in conjunction, yes, with austerity visited by the Tories. Their collapse for half a decade of government here contributed to many of the severe outcomes we have in public services. So it's a little bit rich for the two parties and their leaders to come on and accuse us of being negative when their decisions to collapse government have been a significant part of why we are where we are.
OK, Paula Bradshaw, you've talked about what is included in the draft programme for government. I'll tell you what's not in it, and a lot of people have pointed out. There's very little mention of poverty or social care or, in particular, wastewater infrastructure. Now, let's talk about water. The need for more homes and jobs and a better economy is absolutely clear. All of the experts say that's only achieved by a huge investment in our water infrastructure, and it's not in this document. Why not?
Well, again, I think that there is some detail in there. There's the information around, I think it's £26 billion that they're talking about they're going to put into infrastructure, and they're bringing forward an investment plan. So I think that detail will come forward. But when I reflect on the priorities...
We have an expert in the studio we're going to hear from him very shortly in this particular area, and he says that there is not any kind of detail, the like of which we need to see in this document.
And that's why people need to feed into this consultation process. But whenever I reflect on the priorities that are in this draft programme for government, and I think about the cases that come through my constituency offices in the context of a shortened mandate and very tight financial constraints, I think that the priorities are right. But I agree with you. I think that there should be... No, but it is an important point. I think that there should be 10 instead of 9. I think there should have been one around anti-poverty or tackling social deprivation.
Well, that's interesting that you should say that. And you had your party leader, who's an executive minister, signed off on this, and there are only 9 and not 10. So if she had that argument, she lost it.
No. And we will be responding in terms of the Alliance Party, but also through the committee that I chair. We will be collating those information from...
Do you still want to mutualise the water infrastructure in Northern Ireland?
Well, we think that there needs to be a different model of how we, not how people pay it, but how they are allowed to use the money that's brought in through the rates bill.
So that's the answer, you think, isn't it?
Yes, but it wouldn't be extra money taken from our rates payers. It would actually be given to the NI Water in a different way so that they can invest in a different way. And as you've just pointed out, we very much need investment in the infrastructure around our waterways.
That's the point, isn't it? And your ministerial colleague, John O'Dowd, who is, of course, the infrastructure minister, is responsible for this, and he's made it patently clear that he doesn't agree with the mutualisation model. Why not?
Because mutualisation ends up to individuals paying.
But it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't in Scotland and it doesn't in Wales.
But there is absolutely that risk. John John O'Dowd, as the Infrastructure Minister, has given 500 million towards wastewater infrastructure.
But there's a real consequence. There's a real-life consequence if we don't find a way of actually dealing with this, and that is that developments don't happen. So we try to bring inward investment in, and we say, build your factory. Only you can't build your factory because we don't have a wastewater infrastructure system that will deal with it. Housing, social housing, private housing. Developments are not happening because we don't have a water infrastructure that's actually fit for purpose.
And that's why John O'Dowd, as the Infrastructure Minister, has invested £500 million to NI Water to be able to work towards that. But fundamentally, it gets back to about investment in public infrastructure. The British state is one of the lowest in the OECD countries for investing in public services and public infrastructure. And water is that. You only have to look across at Britain. They privatised the water system.
Nobody's suggesting that. Nobody's suggesting that here.
I have sat in TV chambers like this here and listened to people suggest that water charges the answer, privatisation is the answer, mutualisation is the answer.
Well, mutualisation is not privatisation.
Investment in public services, investment in public infrastructure is the answer.
Investment, yes, but you have to find the money to invest.
And that's why we need the sustainable funding model.
OK, which is a separate issue, is mutualisation in terms of dealing with our water infrastructure something that John O'Dowd needs to sit down and look at again, in your view?
I think it needs to come forward with a number of options on this. As you rightly say, Mark, in relation to our sewage works, it is holding up much needed social housing, much needed investment. But it goes back to the point that there has been an agreement by the executive that this year 500 million is going towards that. And within the programme for government, there's a clear prioritisation for infrastructure investment. So we will see that roll out in the budget that comes forward.
OK, I'm going to come back to you and get your responses to what we're about to hear from the other side of the studio in just a moment. But thank you all very much indeed at this point. I'll be back over there to hear more from the politicians shortly. Let's hear now from the former senior civil servant Andrew McCormick and the chief executive of the Construction Employers Federation, Mark Spence, who've been listening to what we've been discussing. Welcome to both of you. Very interesting views from the politicians. I mean, some degree of unanimity on some issues and not so much on other issues. Andrew McCormick, you said a few weeks ago Stormont has no credibility with the Treasury. Do you still believe that to be the case?
I'm afraid I do. Great that they're back. I would choose this form of government 100 times out of 100. So I'm very delighted compared to when I was last here in January. This is important.
You were here last time just before devolution had come back. So it's good that devolution's in place. What's the but?
So, fourth paragraph of the introduction to the programme for government, we don't have enough money and somebody else should pay. Now, I think a big achievement, remarkable achievement to get the needs-based formula agreed and then further secured by what Keith Archibald delivered in May in the interim fiscal framework. But 124%, that I would have given my eye teeth for that 20 years ago as a settlement.
Alliance says it's not enough.
Well, it's a myth that we've been underfunded for years.
Well, we heard that repeated. I mean, we've heard that around the table tonight.
So most of my career, spending per head in Northern Ireland was 30-40% above the English figure. It was down for a short time. So yes, there was a strong case to make, and therefore putting the floor in, as was agreed earlier this year, very important, very good. But the Treasury has a different view of what the number should be. They've accepted the Fiscal Council's recommendation of 124%. But that includes a health indicator, which is very high. John Appleby, who did work on health, would have a lower figure for health, which would bring the total down to 119. That's one thing that you could do. The Treasury will argue for that. So yes, investments can go up, but it can also go down.
Keith Archibald was there as Finance Minister with the First and Deputy First Ministers meeting the Chancellor Rachel Reeves in London today. Do you see a connection between that and the fact that earlier this week she put out her latest settled position, as we understand it, on a rates review? Is that the start of revenue raising, and was that sending a message to the Treasury that she is a safe pair of hands in charge of the Northern Ireland pounds, shillings and pence?
It sounded like a step in the right direction, a necessary direction. Sorry. All these things are about choices. If the executive was happy to live with the budget they have, then there's no need to raise any more revenue. The problem is they're not, and they're asking other people to pay, taxpayers in poorer areas of England, Scotland and Wales. Paul Boateng, when he was Chief Secretary, said to me at a meeting with Ian Pearson as Minister, why should my constituents in a poor area of London be paying these bills? Someone on the lowest council tax band in a single person flat in Brighton is paying well above the Northern Ireland average. It's a myth that we pay for water through the rates. We just don't. We don't pay enough. Of course, that's a choice. That's a legitimate choice. If the politicians agree, they can do that, but they have to live with the consequences.
OK, well, you mention water and who pays for water, and Mark Spence is with us now, and you've been quoted quite a lot this week talking about this particular issue, because from your perspective as someone who represents construction employers, people who are involved in building houses and other things, they are suggesting that they cannot do what they want to do, what society needs them to do, which is actually engage in building, because our water infrastructure is so dreadful.
Absolutely. I mean, the 9 priorities we totally endorse. Unfortunately, they're not deliverable within the 26 billion, which has been referred to in the document. 26 billion will not deliver the infrastructure we require. The priority for delivering social housing, private housing, mixed tenure housing, all types of sustainable housing, retrofitting, carbon reduction, to us, that just feels disingenuous unless you have a budget to deliver it. But there is nothing in this document that lends us any credibility.
Can you put any figures on it for us, Mark? Can you give us a sense of how badly snagged the system is at the moment? How many houses that ought to be being built are not being built? How far behind where we need to be are we at the moment?
OK, so we're expecting the draft strategy for housing to recommend 10,000 units per year. In the year just past, we built 5,400. That's the lowest for 60 years. This year, we expect it to be the lowest number of housing completions since World War II, and I'm talking about during World War II.
And how much of that is down to the problems with the water infrastructure?
The vast majority of it. So at the moment, our understanding is there are 37,000 applications for connections to water sitting with NI Water, which are likely not to be deliverable. 19,000 of those are absolutely not deliverable because they are in the 25 towns which NI Water have said there will be no more development. That's including Derry, Belfast, Enniskillen, Newry, Dungannon, the list goes on. So even yesterday we had the very impressive news about the development at Magee College. At some point there'll be a decision required in Magee College area. Are we going to build social houses or the college? Because we can't do both. We actually have to pay for one or the other.
OK, so can I just ask you very quickly before we go back to Andrew, how do we actually deal with this? Is it simply about money? And if it is, where does that money come from? Does it come from the developers themselves? Does it come somehow through Northern Ireland Water? Is some kind of mutualisation of the water infrastructure here absolutely necessary? Should John O'Dowd go back to the drawing board and rethink his position on that? I mean, you just heard Chris Hazard say that from any kind of move towards mutualisation means that people end up paying for water, and Sinn Féin won't countenance that.
So for context, the budget agreed with the utility regulator, independent utility regulator, for NI Water to deliver even part of the infrastructure, 600 million a year. At the moment, that's been cut to 300 million. So we have civil engineering companies who, in good faith, ramped up to deliver those works, already laying off staff. However, the money needs to be found, whether it's by mutualisation, and we believe that is a viable option. Unfortunately, in discussions with the Minister, he has ruled that out. We would be willing to work with the Minister on a range of options. We don't think there's any single option will fix this. This is a huge black hole in our finances. We want to work with this executive in a mature manner to find a range of issues which together may go part way to solve it. But at the moment, as it stands, the programme for government is undeliverable without an answer to that problem.
OK. Yeah, Andrew, I think it's fair to say you saw this coming down the tracks quite a few years ago. You could see the pressures building up, no doubt about that. Maybe some others in senior positions within the civil service saw it as well. But an awful lot of people are really just getting to grips with it at the moment, when it seems to be almost too late.
Oh no, it's not too late. There's plenty that can be done, and I think the part of the point is to help the executive. They've never had a long, stable period to get these things organised and get really settled down to solving the problems. So we've got to be very, very supportive to the efforts that they're making and moving in the right direction. But it really does come down to some tough decisions that need to be taken, hard choices that need to be made, living within the budget. So Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are facing down bigger problems at UK level than our problems. The degree of sympathy, the credibility, that's a real problem. We need to have standing with the Treasury. I think the tone seemed good today. There's a recognition that Labour will try to improve public services. That's coming.
But this side of the RC, something needs to change. Something needs
100%,
to move. Absolutely. Otherwise, we're just going to keep going. I mean, I say, it's too late. It's too late if nothing changes and we don't actually free things up to be able to build factories and houses again. Because at the moment we're not doing anything, as Mark has just explained.
Yes, radical steps are needed to fix water service, to fix the health service, where we have deep problems. As someone said there, the programme for government says they can't improve waiting lists. They're actually bound to be deteriorating still. That's all because of detailed aspects of reform. They could take what was said in London today. All those steps are positive. Social care needs addressed because there's so much to do with elective care as a result of the inability of the social care system to function. Hence, back up in ED and then consequences for elective care.
Okay.
That's a whole system reform, as Lord Darcy has said.
Okay. Nonetheless, despite all of those challenges, you remain optimistic.
100%, yes.
Okay. Very good. Important to make that point. Thank you both very much indeed. In the short time we have left, I just want to get the thoughts of the panel briefly, as Andrew and Mark had some very interesting things to say there. And I want to pick up on the comment really that Mark made, that the programme for government is undeliverable if issues with the water infrastructure are not sorted out. Matthew O'Toole, as the opposition voice around the table tonight, is that something that you would endorse?
Yes, clearly water infrastructure is something that needs to be urgently addressed. We can't deal with creating social housing. We know we had a pathetic number of social housing starts last year. We have a plan to deliver tens of thousands over the next decade. That's simply not going to happen without water infrastructure. We can't attract the inward investment we want through dual market access and loads of other things. So we do need to see options from the infrastructure minister. We will look at them as a constructive opposition. We've said, and I think some of the things I've said tonight around looking constructively at options show that we are willing to be constructive. But what we do need is clarity, and we need choices from the executive. And genuinely, truthfully, I'm not saying this just to be churlish, we haven't seen that yet. We didn't see it this week in the programme for government. We have no clear sense that the executive knows what decisions it really wants to take and what direction it wants to prioritise.
So are we going to have that open conversation within the executive? Are we going to see the big parties, the four parties in the executive, and in particular the DUP and Sinn Féin, trying to find common ground and compromising where necessary to do it?
Well, I think you've seen that to date. When you look at Michelle O'Neill and Emily Pengelly to date, and today again in London, standing shoulder to shoulder.
Well, there's a lot of standing shoulder to shoulder and getting photographs taken and talking to the media, but we're talking about decisions, actual decisions.
But that's standing together and going to the Treasury in recent months to get £60 million invested into our public services, Mark, so we shouldn't be so churlish about it. And at the end of the day, it involves negotiation with the Treasury.
We're nearly 300 million short.
The Treasury have went on record as saying that we have been underfunded here. As I've said, we've had 14 years of austerity. We've come on the back of Brexit, we've come on the back of COVID and a crippling cost of living crisis.
You could be even more underfunded. If you bust your budget and the Treasury says, see that 500 million, you're on the hook for it again, as I said earlier on, you're going to be even more underfunded at that point, aren't you?
And that shows the importance of the former Finance Minister, Conor Murphy, established the Fiscal Commission. It identified where the financial firepower is needed for Stormont executives to be able to take the decisions. Some of our local councils have better borrowing powers than our Stormont executive has. That's not sustainable long term. We need to be able to give them the toolbox to go and be able to transform our public services. That needs to be done in partnership with the Treasury, which requires investment.
I want to hear from Paula and Philip in just a moment or two. Before I do that, can I just ask you, because there's been a lot of speculation about this, are you expecting, and you've got your ear to the ground presumably, are you expecting anything from the UK government about Casement Park tomorrow?
Well, we've been clear, Casement Park needs to be developed, it needs to be built. The British government have a commitment and I expect them to fulfil that.
Yeah, sooner rather than later. There's speculation that an announcement will be made this week.
As soon as possible.
OK, so yes, we can expect that, you think?
Well, I hope so. That's been the previous commitment and the British government need to fulfil it. OK,
right. Philip, Brett, can I just ask you about the search for common ground within the executive? To what extent is the DUP up for that bipartisan approach and up for compromise where necessary to actually move everybody, not just DUP supporters and DUP voters, but everybody in this society, all the citizens, all the ratepayers, all the taxpayers, forward to where they want to go?
Yeah, I think we've proven that. The programme for government is not a DUP manifesto. Not everything that we wanted to see included is included. But what we have said is that we've been elected to help lead Northern Ireland to a better future, and we're committed to working with all parties around the executive table to deliver that.
OK, so the DUP's up for it?
We're always up for it. We're elected by the people of Northern Ireland to do that, and will not shy away from our responsibilities.
OK, Paula Bradshaw, are you optimistic that you'll be able to buy into some kind of common ground that will move us forward and that will actually turn an awful lot of the theory of the programme for government into reality in the months and years ahead?
Well, absolutely. I think that it's great that we have a draft programme for government. It's the first one in many, many years, and people have welcomed it this week. There is going to be this process of consultation, and there will be a final document, and we, the Executive Office Committee, will be very keen to see how it is implemented. So I very much agree with Matthew in the sense that we need to see the delivery plan, and we need to have the funding set against that. But look, we have to move forward with maturity, and that was a word that Mark used there around the executive coming together. And we're all up for the tough decisions, but they all have to be evidence-based, and we look forward to the time ahead.
OK, got to leave it there, folks. Covered a lot of ground. I suspect we're going to come back to this a lot between now and Christmas. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Sunday Politics is back this weekend at the usual time of 10 o'clock on BBC One. And if you miss any of our programmes, you can always catch up on the BBC iPlayer. And don't forget our latest Red Lines podcast, which is available now on BBC Sounds. From everyone on the team now, thanks for watching. From all of us, good night.